You have no idea how many nights I sat across from an empty chair and told myself that some people simply aren't built to be chosen. I never imagined that the woman about to tell me the truth had been rehearsing it for 12 years. And now that she's finally sitting in front of me, I don't know whether to be grateful I stayed in that booth or terrified of what staying cost me to find out. My name is Caleb Reyes. I'm 36 years old, and for the last 14 of those years I have been a firefighter, the last 5 of them a captain, which mostly means I'm the one who decides who goes through the door first and who doesn't come out at all if I get it wrong. I've pulled people from places no person should have to be pulled from. I've held hands that were seconds from letting go. I've stood in the rubble of somebody's whole life and told them, in the calmest voice I own, that everything was going to be fine, even when I had no earthly way of knowing that yet. 14 years of running into buildings other people are running out of does something to a man. It teaches you to move fast and feel slow, to keep your voice even when your hands are shaking underneath your gloves, to file every face away in some back room of yourself, because if you carried all of them home, you wouldn't make it to shift 200. I got good at that. I got so good at not carrying anything home that eventually there was nothing waiting there to carry it to. No one leaves a porch light on for a man who's trained himself not to need one. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not the fires, the quiet after. 14 years of coming home to an apartment that smelled faintly of smoke no matter how many times I washed my jacket, eating dinner standing up at the counter, because sitting down at a table built for more than one felt like admitting something. My sister Dana used to call it my monk phase, except a monk phase is supposed to end. She'd been threatening for 2 years to set me up with somebody. I kept telling her I didn't have room in my life for another person to worry about. She kept telling me that wasn't an answer, it was a hiding place. She won, the way she always eventually does, and on a Thursday night in March, she texted me an address, a name, Sophia, and one line that I should have paid more attention to than I did. Trust me on this one, Caleb. This isn't random.
I didn't ask what she meant by that.
I wish, more than almost anything else in this story, that I had. Before I go further, I want to say something directly to you because I've learned these stories find their way to exactly the people who need to hear them. If you've spent your life being the one who shows up for everybody else, the steady one, the one people call at 2 a.m. and never once think to check on in return, stay with me tonight. This one's for you. And if it finds you where you are, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to Kindle Heart Stories, because we make these for the ones who do the carrying and never once get carried. I got to the diner 20 minutes early, which is a habit I picked up from 14 years of being first through doors. It was called the Wren, a squat little building off Route 4 with a neon sign missing its W. So from the road it just said REN, glowing pink against a sky that hadn't decided yet if it wanted to rain. I chose a booth near the window because Dana said Sophia would recognize my truck in the lot, and I sat there in a shirt I'd ironed twice, which for a man who irons nothing, should tell you something about how much I'd let myself hope. 7 o'clock came and went. I told myself traffic. At 7:15, I told myself parking. By 7:30, I had stopped looking at the door, because looking at the door and having it not be her had become its own small, private humiliation, over and over, once every 90 seconds. I want you to sit in that feeling with me for a moment, because it matters later. There is a very particular kind of silence that happens in a diner booth when you understand, before you'll admit it to yourself, that no one is coming. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles, the way smoke settles into a jacket, and after a while you stop noticing it's there at all. You just carry it. By 8, I had the sense that everyone in that diner had figured out what I already knew and was too kind to say. The waitress had come by twice. The first time, I told her I was still waiting on someone. The second time, quieter, I told her the same thing, except this time neither of us believed it. I reached for my wallet to pay for a water I'd barely touched. That's when she came back a third time. Except this time, she didn't stop at the edge of the table with her pad in her hand the way she had the 2 times before. She slid into the booth across from me, into the seat that was supposed to belong to somebody else. I want to describe her the way I saw her that night before I knew anything because it matters what a person looks like before you know what they're carrying. She was somewhere near my age, dark hair pulled back in a loose, efficient way of someone who spent a long shift on her feet, an apron with a coffee stain shaped like a comma just above the pocket. There was something tired around her eyes that wasn't about the hour. And there was something else, something I couldn't name yet, that made her look at me like she already knew things about me I hadn't said out loud. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this is strange. I've been standing at that counter for almost 45 minutes trying to talk myself out of this." I figured she felt sorry for me. That's the only place my mind had room to go. A woman watches a man get stood up for the better part of an hour, and eventually kindness wins out over professional distance, and she comes to say something soft before he leaves. I brace myself for the gentle version of pity, which, if you've never received it, is somehow worse than the unkind kind, because you can't even be angry about it. That is not what happened. She studied my face a moment longer than any stranger has a right to. The way you study a word on a page you're almost certain you've spelled wrong your whole life. And then she said the sentence that took the floor out from under that entire evening. "You don't know who I am, but I think you might be the reason I'm still alive." I want you to imagine sitting with that. A stranger, in a waitress uniform, telling you across a stained diner table that you are the reason she is breathing. I have had people say a version of that to me before. It comes with the job, the thank yous, the cards at Christmas, the occasional hug from someone whose name I never learned because by the time I meet them, I'm usually looking at the back of an ambulance, not their face. But there was something in the particular stillness of how she said it. Not gratitude performing itself for an audience. Something older. Something that had been rehearsed in private at 2 a.m. for longer than she wanted to admit. "I think you have me confused with somebody else," I told her, because that's what 14 years of forgetting faces trains you to say. I meet a lot of people on the worst day of their life. They tend to blur. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I have to be the one to remember for both of us." And then she told me. 12 years ago, she said, on a night in October, there had been a car on Route 9, folded around a guardrail, a 14-year-old girl in the back seat with her seatbelt cutting into her collarbone, and her mother unconscious in the front and glass everywhere, catching the emergency lights like something almost beautiful if it hadn't been the worst night of her life. She said the first responder through the door of that wreckage had been a young firefighter, barely out of his rookie year, who had gotten his gloved hand through a gap in the crushed metal and found her hand in the dark before he found anything else. She said he hadn't yelled. Everyone else that night had been yelling. The machinery, the radios, the other men calling out numbers she didn't understand. And this one voice had found her in all of it and stayed low and even and said, "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. You just have to breathe with me." I felt something shift in my chest before my memory caught up to my body. Some things live in your hands longer than they live in your head. "In for 4, she said quietly, watching my face the entire time. "Hold for 4. Out for 4. You made me count it out loud with you while they cut the door off the car. You told me later, when I asked, that you did it because a person who's counting can't panic at the same time. You said it like it was nothing. Like it was just the job." It was the job. I'd done some version of that 1,000 times since. The breathing, the counting, the low, steady voice that gives a terrified person somewhere to put their fear besides the thing that's actually happening to them. To me, that night on Route 9 had been one entry in a logbook, one of hundreds, filed somewhere in the back room of myself I'd stopped visiting a long time ago. To her, apparently, it had been the hinge her entire life turned on. "I never got your name," she said. "You were gone before the second ambulance even left. I asked at the hospital for weeks. Nobody could tell me which crew had been first on scene, and then my mother needed 3 surgeries and we moved states to be near my aunt, and life just happened the way it does, over the top of the thing you swore you'd never let go of. But I never stopped looking. Not really. I'd see a fire truck and my whole body would still, just for a second, the way it did that night. I used to wonder if I'd imagined how calm you were. If memory had smoothed it into something better than it actually was. She reached up and pulled a thin silver chain out from under the collar of her uniform. On it hung something small and dented, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. A metal button, the kind stamped onto the cuff of a turnout coat, half melted along one edge. "This came off your jacket," she said. It was on the floor of the car. I kept it in my hand the whole ambulance ride, because it was the only thing in that night that felt like proof I wasn't going to die. I've worn it since I was 14 years old. I sat there with my hand still half around my wallet, a man who spends his professional life being the calm one in the room, and I could not find a single word to put in the space where a word was supposed to be. You would think that was the whole story. A rescued girl grown into a woman, a chance encounter 12 years later in a diner off Route 4, gratitude finally finding its way home. It's the kind of thing that would already be enough to end an evening with both people in tears, and a phone number exchanged, and a slow, sweet, ordinary kind of falling in love.
It is not the whole story.
It isn't even close. Because here is the part she had not told me yet, the part she was still working up the nerve to say, while I sat there with a stranger's 12-year-old rescue folded into my hands like something I hadn't earned the right to hold. Her name, she finally said, watching me carefully now. The way you watch someone right before you tell them something you're afraid will change how they look at you forever, was Sophia. I felt the floor tilt a second time in the same 10 minutes. Sophia, I repeated. That's the name my sister gave me tonight. That's who I was supposed to be meeting. She didn't answer right away, and in the silence before she did, something in her face closed, just slightly, the way a door closes when someone on the other side has decided they can't take back what they're about to say, only brace for what happens after they say it. "I know," she said finally. "I've known since 6:40 when you walked in and I was standing behind the counter in an apron I only put on 40 minutes before you got here because I own half of this diner with my aunt, and I called her in a panic from the parking lot and told her I needed a job for one night, any job, because I physically could not, walk up to that booth as your date. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment because I think it's the part of the story people understand least until it happens to them. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even hurt yet. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific, dropping sensation of understanding that the last hour and a half of your life, the hour and a half you'd already started quietly rewriting into the best night you'd had in years, had been staged. Not maliciously, not cruelly, but staged by someone who had known exactly who I was before I knew anything about her at all. So this whole night, I said slowly, the waitress, the coffee, all of it. That was you deciding whether to show up. Yes. Why didn't you just walk through the door as Sophia? Your sister set this up. My sister set this up. You already knew who I was. What was there to decide? She looked down at the button on the chain in her hand, turning it over once between her fingers, the way you turn over something you've turned over 10,000 times before. Because for 12 years, she said, I built you into something in my head that wasn't a person anymore. You were the reason I was alive. You were the voice in the dark. You were the thing I told my therapist about, the thing I told the boy who eventually became my ex-husband about on our first date, the thing I still think about every single October when the leaves change and the air gets that specific cold.
You were never a man to me, Caleb.
You were an idea I'd been carrying around since I was 14. And when your sister, my co-worker, who had no idea about any of this until 3 weeks ago when I finally told her the whole story and she went pale and said, Caleb, my brother, when she told me who you actually were, I panicked. Because what if the real you didn't match the 12 years I'd spent building you into a myth? What if I sat down as Sophia, your date, and you looked at me the way people look at someone they feel obligated to be grateful toward, instead of someone they actually want? I couldn't survive that. So I told myself I'd watch first.
Just for a little while.
Just long enough to know if the man was as real as the myth. And I heard myself ask, because some reckless, hopeful part of me needed to know the answer, even in the middle of feeling like the ground had opened underneath the whole evening. And you sat in that booth for 40 minutes being stood up by a version of me you hadn't met yet, she said, and you didn't get angry. You didn't make a scene. You just got quieter and sadder in a way that told me everything about how many times in your life you've quietly absorbed being the one nobody comes back for. And somewhere around minute 30, I stopped watching you like a myth and started watching you like a man I was terrified of actually falling for. That's when it stopped being about the button on the chain. That's when it became about you. Tonight.
Right now.
Not 14-year-old me in the back of a wrecked car.
This.
And I didn't know how to walk that back into something honest without telling you the whole ugly, complicated truth of how I got here. I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the coffee she'd set down without asking went cold between us, the way things do when the moment matters more than the object. Here is the thing about being the calm one for 14 years. You get very good at managing other people's chaos and very bad at knowing what to do with your own. Some part of me, the part trained to walk toward the fire instead of away from it, wanted to reach across that table and tell her it didn't matter, that a lie born out of fear wasn't really a lie at all, that I understood better than almost anyone alive what it means to hide behind competence because the alternative is being seen. But another part of me, quieter and much older, the part that remembers every single time in my life someone decided for me what I could and couldn't handle knowing, felt something crack. You watched me get stood up, I said slowly, by you, for 40 minutes. And you let me sit there feeling like garbage, deciding in real time whether I was worth the truth. Yes, she said, and to her credit, she didn't flinch from it. That's exactly what I did. And I know there's no way to say that back to you that makes it sound like anything other than what it was. I want to tell you, I had something wise to say in that moment. I didn't. I put money on the table for a water and a pie I hadn't ordered and a coffee I hadn't finished, and I told her, as gently as I could manage with my hands not entirely steady, that I needed some air. She didn't stop me. She didn't chase me to the door the way people do in the version of this story that ends easy. She just sat there in the booth that was supposed to be hers from the start, holding a melted button on a chain, and watched a man walk out into a parking lot who 14 years of running into burning buildings had never once taught him how to run from something honest instead. I sat in my truck under the buzzing gas station light across the street for 45 minutes before I could make myself drive home. And on the way home, the old voice found me, the one that's always patient, the one that always knows exactly what to say. It told me this was proof, finally, of the thing I'd suspected my whole adult life, that I was someone people managed rather than someone people chose. That even gratitude, when it finally arrived 12 years late, came wrapped in a lie because the truth of me, alone, hadn't been enough to walk through the door for. I believed that voice for exactly 9 days. 9 days is a long time when you're waiting to see if someone is going to fight for something. I didn't call. I told myself that was dignity. Really, it was the same old trick, the one I'd been running my whole life. Leave first before you can be the one left. I worked my shifts. I drove past the exit for the Ren 4 separate times without taking it, which, if you know anything about a man who runs into fires for a living, tells you exactly how frightened he actually was. On the 10th day, Dana showed up at the station unannounced, still in her work clothes, and sat on the tailgate of the rescue truck like she used to when we were kids, and she wanted to have a conversation I couldn't walk away from. "She's not the villain of this, Caleb," Dana said, before I'd said a single word. "She's the 14-year-old girl who watched her mother almost die and held on to a stranger's kindness for 12 years because it was the only proof she had that the world wasn't only cruel. And then that stranger turned out to be my brother, who has spent his entire adult life making sure nobody gets close enough to disappoint him first. You two didn't meet each other in that diner. You collided with each other. That's different. Collisions leave marks. You're allowed to be angry about the marks. You are not allowed to pretend the collision didn't matter." I told her I needed time. She told me time was fine, as long as I understood the difference between taking time and hiding inside it, because she'd watched me do the second one for 14 years, and she wasn't going to pretend it looked like the first one anymore. On the 16th day, a small package arrived at the station, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize yet, but would come to know very well. Inside was the melted button on its silver chain, and a card with 4 words on it. Nothing else. In for 4. Whenever you're ready. I held that card longer than I've held almost anything in my life. Because here is what I finally understood. Standing in the bunk room with my crew pretending not to notice a grown man go still over a piece of jewelry. She had given me back the exact thing I had once given her in the worst moment of her life. A rhythm to hold on to. Something to follow that wasn't the fear itself. She wasn't chasing me. She was doing what I had taught her to do 12 years earlier without either of us knowing it would ever come back around. She was giving me room to breathe and trusting that if I did, I'd find my own way back to the surface. I drove to the Ren that night, off shift, still in the shirt I'd worn to a call 2 hours earlier, and I did not care. She was behind the counter again, this time in her own name, and when the bell over the door announced me, she went very still, the exact stillness I remembered from a stairwell story I hadn't lived, only inherited. "You came back," she said. "I've been coming back my whole life," I told her. "I just usually do it for other people's emergencies. I've never once done it for my own." We sat in the same booth. I want to tell you the whole conversation, but some of it belongs only to the two of us, the way some things in every good story have to stay unspoken to stay true. I will tell you what I told her, because I think it's the part that matters most for anyone listening tonight who has ever done what I did for 16 days, hidden inside their own hurt because it felt safer than risking a second one. I told her that I understood, more than she probably knew, what it means to build a person up into an idea because the idea is easier to survive than the reality of needing them. I told her that 14 years of running toward other people's worst nights had taught me to be excellent at showing up for strangers and terrible at letting anyone show up for me, and that some tired, wounded part of me had used her lie as an excuse to do the thing I always do, leave before I could be disappointed on purpose, instead of by accident. I told her the anger had been real. I told her it had also, if I was honest, been convenient. She told me something back that I think about more than almost anything else that happened between us. She said that for 12 years, she had been so certain that gratitude and love were the same shape that she'd never once let herself ask what she actually wanted from the man in the stairwell, versus what she thought she owed him. Sitting in that booth watching me get stood up by a version of her that hadn't found the courage yet, she said, was the first time in 12 years the two feelings had come apart from each other cleanly. And what was left, once gratitude stepped aside, wasn't a debt at all. It was just want. Plain, uncomplicated, terrifying want for a man she was meeting, in the truest sense, for the very first time. We took it slow after that because slow was the only honest speed for two people who had each spent over a decade learning not to trust the ground under a good thing. There were dinners at the Wren after closing, her aunt sliding into the booth uninvited more nights than not to tell embarrassing stories about Sophia as a teenager that made her cover her face with both hands and made me love her more with every single one. There were nights I sat in the parking lot of the fire station turning that melted button over in my own hand the way she'd once turned it over in hers, understanding for the first time in my adult life what it means to carry something because it's precious, not because you're afraid to put it down. The hardest part, same as always, was me. 6 weeks in, when things started to feel too good in a way my whole nervous system didn't trust, I did what I've always done. I found reasons to be busy. I let calls go unreturned for a day, then 2. And Sophia, who by then understood exactly which move that was, didn't chase me and didn't let me disappear either. She sent one text. For words, the only 4 words that have ever mattered between us. In for 4. I'm here. I drove to the Wren that night instead of away from it, the way I have every single time since that she's had to remind me who I'm allowed to be honest with. I told her I was scared. I told her that a man who spends his life being the steady one doesn't know what to do when someone finally wants to be steady for him in return, and that some old, stubborn part of me kept waiting for the version of this story where she realizes the real me doesn't measure up to whatever she carried in her chest for 12 years. She looked at me across that same booth in the same restaurant, under the same buzzing neon sign missing its W, and she said the thing that finally let me stand still. I already know the real you, Caleb. I've known him since I was 14 years old, holding onto a stranger's hand in the dark. The myth was never the problem. You were always enough. You just never believed anyone could want the man instead of the miracle. It's been 3 years since that first Thursday night. Sophia and I got married at the Wren, after hours, her aunt cooking the whole reception herself, Dana crying before the vows even started because she's the one who set the whole impossible thing in motion with a single text that said, "Trust me on this one." Max, no, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's no Max in this one. Only us and a baby girl we had last spring who we named Ember because Sophia said it felt right for a story that started with fire and ended with something warm enough to build a whole life around. I still run into buildings for a living.
Somebody has to.
But I come home now, every shift, to a porch light that's always on, because Sophia decided a long time ago that no man who spends his life running toward other people's worst nights should ever again come home to darkness. That's the whole difference between the man I was for 14 years and the man I am now. It sounds small. It is everything. We keep the button on its chain in a small wooden box on our dresser, not worn anymore, just kept, the way you keep the things that taught you something you needed to learn. Some nights, when Ember can't sleep, Sophia sits by her crib and breathes with her, slow and even, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and I stand in the doorway and think about a 14-year-old girl in the back of a wrecked car who didn't know yet that the rhythm a stranger gave her to survive one terrible night would end up being the rhythm her own daughter fell asleep to 12 years and one impossible diner booth later. People ask me sometimes what I think I did to deserve any of this. The wife, the daughter, the porch light that's always on after 14 years of coming home to nothing. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't do anything to deserve it, not on purpose. I did my job one ordinary Tuesday in October, 12 years before I understood what it had cost, or what it would someday give back. I have no idea how many other Tuesdays like that are still out there in my past, quietly waiting for their own strange, impossible night to walk back through a door and sit down across from me. And that, I think, is the real truth Sophia was trying so hard to work up the courage to tell me that first night. The one she was afraid I'd never forgive her for taking so long to say. Not the rescue, not the button, not even the lie of the waitress uniform. The truth underneath all of it was simpler and harder than any of that. That she had spent 12 years believing she owed her whole life to a stranger's kindness, when the truth was that kindness like that was never a debt in the first place. It was a gift, given freely, by a tired man who never once expected it to find its way back to him. We go through our lives so certain that the good we do disappears the moment it leaves our hands, that we are only ever the steady background in somebody else's story, never the ones anyone comes back for. And the whole time, we have no way of knowing which ordinary Tuesday, which forgotten stairwell, which quiet, unremarkable act of showing up is quietly saving the rest of our own life, 12 years before we're told. So, if you're watching this tonight certain that you are only ever the one who shows up, the one who carries, the one who gets left waiting in a booth while the world decides whether you're worth the truth, I want you to hear this from a man who used to believe exactly that. You don't know which of your forgotten kindnesses is still out there, waiting for its own impossible night to walk back through a door and sit down across from you. You just have to be brave enough, when it finally does, to stay in the booth long enough to hear the truth. To stand still. To let somebody choose you back. Because no matter how many nights you've spent believing you were built to be the one who carries and never the one who gets carried, I promise you, you have already mattered more than you know. A waitress sat down across from me and told me so. I just had to stay long enough to let it be true. If this story found you tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and who you thought of while you listened. And if you believe, like I do now, that no kindness is ever really wasted, subscribe to Kindled Heart Stories, because we make these for the ones who do the carrying, and we'll keep telling them until every last one of you knows you were never invisible at all.